If it had been almost any other reporter on the BBC who'd been on the front pages for non-criminal reasons,
Mm.
they would probably have survived. But I do think there's this thing about the anchorman, and maybe it's old-fashioned, maybe it goes right back to Richard Dimbleby and the BBC in the 50s. But the anchorman, the man who announces the Queen's death, who then guides us through the coronation of her
Mm.
successor, he there's got to be some sort of integrity there that is can can be seen, vouched for, isn't talked about.
Now, on the front page of the Times today is a picture of one of the most famous men in Britain, although you haven't seen him for a while. The BBC newsreader Huw Edwards, who's been on our screens at the BBC for 40 years, has resigned. He was accused of paying a young person £35,000 and receiving explicit pictures. We can talk to the Times' Andrew Billen, who interviewed him just days before he stopped working at the BBC. Morning, Andrew.
Morning, Asma.
Um, do you, maybe there's an air of inevitability about this, I don't know, but the manner of it is quite, I don't know, interesting in that it's not the warmest of statements from the BBC.
No, there's stories, aren't there, of the lawyers being all over the statement, but it does seem to me extraordinary that the man who presented the flagship bulletin, the BBC News at 10, for 20 years, leaves without even a word of thanks
Mm.
for his work. I think the inevitability is right. I haven't spoken to Hugh since I met him just before the story was broken by the Sun last summer. But we assume there are mental health difficulties there. He's not fit really to return to that job because of the rumours, the scandal, and he's just that the trust between that's so important for an anchorman with his audience has been broken.
Mm. And this is on medical grounds. I think that one of the statements said, and you remember that I'm just rereading your article. His wife at the time, when she named him, said once he's well enough to respond to these allegations or to these stories or whatever it was at the time, he will. But that seems that it's a while off still.
Certainly, and the investigation that the BBC launched into his conduct and the way the BBC administration responded to it has gone nowhere really because they haven't been able to talk to him. He hasn't been well enough to explain his conduct or put his case. And it's a tragic situation for a man who wanted so much to be the number one anchorman in Britain, and for 20 years was, and finally in 2019 got to host the general election coverage for the BBC, which it was extraordinarily difficult to extract David Dimbleby from that seat. He'd done it for
Mm.
10 general elections, and Huw had finally got in there, and I think was hoping certainly to do one more election and maybe more than that.
Do you think that though that I was going to say who will replace him kind of permanently and actually, but I wonder if it matters. If we've been asking this question 10 or 20 years ago, it'd be a big deal because it was a big coveted job. And I'm not saying that it's not, but I think that I mean, I don't watch flagship news programs anymore, and I don't know whether I'm typical or not. But I wonder if it matters so much really who takes over.
We probably go to bed a bit early for the news at 10 on either side. I
Yes.
think you're right. There's so many more places you can get your news now. The audiences for the flagship programs have gone right down. So there isn't that bond between the viewer and the guy. It was always a guy, by the way, wasn't it? The anchor man, the votive voice who
Mm.
would deliver the news, good or bad. But I'm absolutely fascinated by anchors. So I just rushed out to get my copy of the Radio Times to see who would be presenting the local elections next Thursday on May the 2nd on the BBC.
Mm.
And the listing is 11:40 p.m. The BBC's correspondents reporting the outcomes of the council and mayoral elections taking place in some parts of England.
Oh,
That's it.
oh dear.
Who's doing it?
Who knows?
Who cares? Listen to Times Radio if you want the local elections, Andrew. That's what I'd say.
Okay.
I'm glad to hear you be there. I'll be there. Yeah.
Just finally, again, I suppose we're talking generally, really, I suppose now, because we've had certain MPs in the spotlight for stuff they've done. There were these allegations, although the police said there was nothing criminal around Huw Edwards. Are there any lessons that can be taken from people behaving in a certain way in their private lives that then become public?
I think if it'd been almost any other reporter on the BBC who'd been on the front pages for non-criminal reasons, they would probably have survived. But I do think there's this thing about the anchorman, and maybe it's old-fashioned, maybe it goes right back to Richard Dimbleby and the BBC in the 50s. But the anchorman, the man who announces the Queen's death, who then guides us through the coronation of her successor, there's got to be some sort of integrity there that can be seen, vouched for, isn't talked about. I think maybe I'm old-fashioned about that.
When someone leaves a work after 40 years of highly successful service to a company, it's usually marked by something, a few cringy speeches, a glass of warm wine, perhaps even a tear or two. But the BBC newsreader, Huw Edwards, got a 55-word statement. So what went on inside the BBC? The Times media correspondent has his sources at the corporation who've painted a picture for him. That is, of course, Alex Farber. Morning, Alex.
Morning, Asma.
Right. Tell us then, what is this picture?
Well, the picture, look, there is some sadness. It's not as if people were completely jumping for joy about the news that Huw Edwards, one of the corporation's, as you know, highest profile newsreaders, was no longer going to be working for them. But it was definitely tinged with some relief that the situation has now been resolved and that everyone at the BBC can sort of move on and look to the future.
And so there was a meeting apparently where who was at the meeting, because these people in the meeting were kind of forewarned that this statement was going to go out.
Yeah, so look, it was a courtesy meeting. So the news broke around 2:00 yesterday afternoon. The BBC released, as you say, a very short statement in which it confirmed that Huw had resigned, which was long expected. Just ahead of that, Deborah Turnis, the chief executive of the news division, she called in a number of people who have worked with Huw, specifically those working on the 1, 6 and 10 news bulletins, almost as a courtesy to say, look, this news is going to be coming out shortly. We know this has been hard for everybody, but we're now drawing a line on it, under it, and we want everyone to move on as we gear up for a busy election period. She didn't take any questions. I don't think the BBC is really keen to engage in much in what effectively boils down to an HR matter.
Yeah.
And it will be, really hoping that it can put this episode behind it and move on and start to look towards as to who's going to be Huw's sort of longer term replacement on the news at 10 as the face of the country's news, and also who's going to be taking charge of its election coverage as we get into the weeds of that.
Yeah. So who's in the running for both those things?
So we think that Clive Myrie is a potential front runner to take over from Huw. He's very much been a prominent face on the bulletin since Huw's absence over the last 12 months. Rita Chakrabarti, she's also been doing quite a few shifts. In terms of the election coverage, it looks like we're going to have Laura Kunsberg is going to be overseeing proceedings alongside Clive, and Nick Robinson. I also expect to sort of step up and perhaps take on the sort of Andrew Neil interviewer style interviews with the leaders.
Okay, well, we won't be watching that because we'll be listening to Times Radio. Alex, thank you very much. That's Alex Farber, who is the Times' media correspondent.